And the friendship between Jonathan and David began when David recognized this mutual harmony that there was between themselves as men. Roberts continues, "It is marvelous how different the effect of different men is upon our spirit. Some men's company shuts our mouth and seals our lips as if we were imprisoned. Other believers unlock our tongue and draw forth the secrets of our hearts so that we can tell them all our thoughts and trust them with all our secrets. Some men cow and intimidate us so that we put up a wall of defense around our real thoughts till they're gone. Others win their way to our affections at once and melt our reserve so that we can share our choicest meditations with them. Some men bring out the best in us and some bring out the worst. It's hard to say how all this works, but it's a fact of life. And you know, brethren, that is true. Some people bring out the best in you. Other people bring out the worst. It's best to spend your time with those who bring out the best and to avoid, if you can, those who bring out the worst." What did David and Jonathan have in common? If a common interest is essential to all true friendships, what was it that David and Jonathan had in common? What were their common interests? How did they both mutually understand that their hearts vibrated in sympathy one with another immediately? What was it that they had in common? Well, I want to suggest that there were two great things that they had in common. One was not as important as the other, and the lesser important thing that they had in common was this, that both were accomplished warriors and both had an interest in martial matters. Both were accomplished warriors. And David is described in that way. We've already seen that, of how he is described almost as we would describe a Renaissance man, a man who could do it all, a man who was a musician, a man who was a poet, a man who was an outdoorsman, a man who was a warrior. David could do it all, a man of letters and a man of action. He was a warrior. Jonathan was as well. We've seen how Jonathan was not afraid to just take his armor bearer along and attack a Philistine garrison, and to do it with just him and his armor bearer following, putting to death the men that Jonathan had mortally wounded. Jonathan was a warrior. David was a warrior. They shared this in common. They shared martial interests in common, outdoor interests in common. They were men of action. They had that in common. Undoubtedly, their souls vibrated one towards the other when they recognized these things. But there was something else that was in common between them, and this was the more important of the two. And that is that both were godly men. David was a godly young man. Jonathan was a godly older man. In one essay I've read recently on the chronology of the Old Testament, there's a suggestion that Jonathan may have been 20 years his senior. But that doesn't really matter in friendship. That age disparity doesn't really matter in real friendship. But their souls beat in harmony with one another, not just because of their martial interests, and not just because they were courageous men, and not just because they were men of action, but because they were both godly men. David as a godly young man, and Jonathan as a godly older man. David said this when he went into combat with Goliath. David could say these words, and these indicate how godly he was. "You come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you. And I will give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there's a God in Israel. And that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and He will give you into our hands." Those are the words of a godly man going into combat. He was a spiritually minded man when he went into combat. He was a man who believed in what God would do and what God could do through weak vessels. The same was true of Jonathan. We read this concerning Jonathan when David was running from Saul, and Jonathan sought him out in the wilderness. In 1 Samuel 23:15-18, read this way: Now David became aware that Saul had come out to seek his life, while David was in the wilderness of Ziph at Horesh. And Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David at Horesh and encouraged him in God. And the only kind of man that could encourage you in God is a godly man. And so their souls beat in harmony with one another. And this was the explanation for the beginning of this wonderful friendship that lasted for so many years. And so when Jonathan saw David standing there with Goliath's bloody head and heard his answers to his father's questions, he saw before him a kindred spirit, a man he was instantly attracted to, a man with many common interests, a man that he loved instantly as he loved himself. Here's love at first sight, and it's friendship love at first sight. This is a wonderful description of the kind of friendship that all of us should desire to have. If you don't have friends like this, you better find out what the reason is. You better find out what it is in you that holds you back from having friends like this. And you better pray that God would grant you some close relationship with somebody that will prove to be as salutary and as helpful as this was between David and Jonathan. 1 Samuel 20:17b says he loved him as he loved his own life. He loved him as he loved his own life. Observe in the second place the action instigated by Jonathan and what it signified. Jonathan instigates a covenant between himself and David. This was a very significant one, and the significance is not often closely understood. I can remember when I was a kid. Maybe I shouldn't say this because I don't want any boys emulating me in this, but sometimes we would have these rituals that boys would go through to cement our friendships together. And I won't. I'll keep the moms happy this evening. But here's a covenant ritual that Jonathan went through with David that's very significant, and let me try to explain it to you. Verse 3 and 4 says this: Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, including his sword and his bow and his belt. So Jonathan initiated the covenant, as 1 Samuel 20 and verse 8 makes clear, when David says, Therefore deal kindly with your servant, for you have brought your servant into a covenant of the Lord with you. Jonathan was the one who initiated this covenant. It was Jonathan's idea. And what we must understand is this: there was no reciprocity in this covenant making. In other words, when it says that Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him, the royal robe that was on him, and gave it to David with his armor, including his sword and his bow and his belt, there was no reciprocity. He wasn't expecting anything in return. You remember what happened when David killed Goliath. What did he do? Well, he had trophies from that combat. It tells us there in 1 Samuel chapter 17 that David took the Philistine's head and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his weapons in his tent. He took Goliath's giant sword, he took Goliath's spear, and he took Goliath's javelin, and he took Goliath's shield, and he put them in his tent. But he didn't give any of those things to Jonathan in reciprocity. Jonathan initiates the covenant, and Jonathan gives David the royal robe that he wore. He gives David the armor that he wore. He gives David his sword. He gives David his bow. He gives David his arrows. And David gives nothing in return to Jonathan.